My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 35 years old and work as an accountant. They say life is unpredictable, and that couldn't be truer for my life. 5 years ago, I had a fateful encounter at a local coffee shop. That day, my usual spot was taken, so I reluctantly sat next to a stranger. He struck up a conversation, saying, "The latte here is simply divine." That was the beginning. The man's name was Mark Miller. At 37, he was a successful architect. I was immediately drawn to his gentle nature and intellectual charm. Mark proposed to me by quoting a line from a movie, "You had me at hello." It was as romantic as could be. Our wedding was small but heartwarming. Newlywed life was smooth sailing, with both our careers on track and happiness abounding. Then, in our second year of marriage, we received surprising news. I was pregnant. Mark and I were overcome with joy, tears streaming down our faces. "What a blessing to be given a new life," Mark said excitedly. Though there were anxieties during the pregnancy, Mark's support helped me through it all. Then came the long-awaited day of delivery. The labor pains were more intense than I'd imagined, but the moment Emily was born, it was all worth it. When I held her tiny hand, I vowed to protect her and make her happy. Emily's birth changed our lives dramatically. Nighttime feedings, diaper changes, sleepless nights. But every time we saw Emily's smile, all the fatigue just melted away. "Hey, Mark. Don't Emily's fingers look just like ours?" "They sure do. She'll grow up to be as beautiful as you, no doubt." With such conversations, we gradually shaped our new family dynamic. Emily's growth brought us new joys every day. Her first rollover, her first word, her first steps. Each moment felt like a small miracle, and we carefully recorded every precious milestone. "Sarah, you're an amazing mother," Mark would often say. Those words warmed my heart when I was exhausted. Little did we know that this happy event would soon bring a great trial to our family. 3 months after Emily's birth, my maternity leave was coming to an end. Should I return to work or dedicate myself to childcare? This decision would lead to unforeseen consequences that I couldn't have imagined at the time. I had a strong desire to return to work. I didn't want to give up my career as an accountant, and honestly, we needed my income. Mark's salary alone wouldn't cover the costs of raising Emily. But when I thought about Emily, my heart ached. Was it okay to leave a 3-month-old baby with someone else? Wouldn't she miss me? Such worries kept crossing my mind. After much deliberation, I discussed it with Mark. "Sarah, your work is important. We'll figure it out together," Mark said, giving me a bit of courage. In the end, I decided to return to work. However, I started with part-time, 4 days a week, instead of full-time. Fortunately, my company was understanding and accepted this proposal. But a new problem arose. We needed to find someone to take care of Emily. We couldn't find a daycare that would accept a 3-month-old baby, and hiring a babysitter was too expensive. That's when Mark made a suggestion. "What about asking my mother?" Honestly, I was hesitant at first. I didn't have a particularly close relationship with my mother-in-law, Judith. But with no other options, we decided to ask Judith. She had recently retired and had time on her hands. When we explained the situation over the phone, Judith surprisingly agreed readily. Taking care of my granddaughter. There's nothing that could make me happier, Judith said, which put me a bit at ease. However, I still felt a nagging worry. I wondered if Judith could really take proper care of Emily. Judith arrived at our house a week before I was to return to work. At 62, Judith was petite but exuded an air of authority. Her graying hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore crisply ironed clothes. "Please take care of her, Judith," I said, to which she smiled thinly and replied, "Oh, Sarah. No need for such formalities. Call me Mom." I felt a bit uneasy at her words but decided to comply for the sake of keeping the peace. Judith immediately began inspecting every corner of the house. "This should be done this way, that should be placed there for efficiency," she kept giving instructions. She also had many opinions about our childcare methods. "You're changing diapers wrong, the feeding intervals are off, you're too soft on putting her to sleep." Each of Judith's words chipped away at my confidence. Mark would say, "Mom is experienced, she must be saying these things with good intentions," but to me, it all sounded like criticism. Still, Judith's help was essential for me to return to work. I decided to grit my teeth and bear it. The day before I returned to work, I gave Judith detailed instructions. The location of Emily's favorite stuffed animal, her preferred toys, her habits and preferences. Judith listened silently, but in the end, she said, "Don't worry, I've got this. Leave it to me." That night, I confided my worries to Mark. "Is Judith really okay? Will she take proper care of Emily?" Mark hugged my shoulders and encouraged me, "It'll be fine. Mom can be strict, but she always puts children first. Let's trust her." The next morning, I left the house with heavy steps. Looking back, I saw Judith holding Emily at the entrance. "Have a good day." "Don't worry," Judith said, which reassured me a little. However, I had no idea how the new days ahead would affect our family. After a few weeks of returning to work, I was beginning to understand more about Judith's personality and background. From conversations with Mark and Judith's casual comments, I started to see glimpses of her life story. Judith was born in the 1960s to a strict military father and a stay-at-home mother. She grew up in a rigid household environment. It was a family where suppressing emotional expression and valuing discipline were considered virtues. I realized that this background greatly influenced Judith's childcare approach. She emphasized strict schedules and didn't immediately respond to Emily's cries. "Let her cry. You mustn't spoil her," she would say. Emily also seemed to be struggling with Judith's presence. Usually not shy around people, Emily would often burst into tears in front of Judith. After a few weeks, subtle changes began to appear in Emily's behavior. She used to smile happily when she saw my face in the morning, but recently she had become expressionless. She also cried more at night and had trouble falling asleep. Noticing these changes, I became increasingly anxious and conflicted. Is something wrong with Emily? Is there a problem with Judith's childcare methods? Such questions kept crossing my mind. Even when I consulted Mark, he would only say, "Let's trust Mom." I started to get irritated with Mark for not understanding my concerns. "Mark, something's wrong with Emily. Don't you think there might be a problem with how Judith is raising her? Sarah, Mom is experienced. Don't you think you're just being oversensitive?" As we repeated such conversations, tension began to build in our marriage. One Friday evening, I returned home earlier than usual from work. When I arrived, an eerie silence hung over the house. There was no response when I called out, "Emily." "Judith." Driven by anxiety, I searched the house and heard a faint noise coming from the bedroom. When I opened the door, the sight before me made my blood run cold. Emily was lying in her crib, but her body was tightly wrapped in soft towels. She was screaming, her face bright red. And Judith was sitting on the sofa, watching TV. "What on earth are you doing?" I cried out. Judith, showing no sign of distress, said, "This is the most efficient way. I can rest, and Emily is safe." I immediately picked up Emily and untied the towels binding her. When I checked Emily's body, I found light bruises on her arms and legs. Probably marks from being tied up. "Why would you do such a thing?" I confronted Judith, and she calmly replied, "You're too lenient. Discipline is necessary." At that moment, Emily's body suddenly stiffened, and she began to convulse. Her pupils rolled upward, and her breathing became shallow. "Emily! Emily!" I desperately called my daughter's name. But Emily didn't respond. In a panic, I dialed 911. "It's an emergency. My 3-month-old daughter is having a seizure. Her breathing. While following the operator's instructions, I continued to hold Emily tightly. When we heard the ambulance sirens, Judith was still sitting on the sofa. "You're overreacting, Sarah." "This is how we raised children in my day," Judith muttered. Looking at her, I realized she truly didn't understand. The paramedics arrived and quickly put Emily on a stretcher. I got into the ambulance with her, but the fear and anxiety I felt at that moment are indescribable. Watching Emily's tiny body continue to convulse, I headed to the hospital with a prayerful heart. The hospital emergency room was in chaos. Emily was immediately taken to the treatment room, and I waited in the waiting room, trembling with anxiety. Mark arrived 30 minutes later. "Sarah, what's going on?" Mark rushed over, out of breath. I explained the situation through tears. I could see Mark's face contort with anger and fear. An hour later, the doctor came to us. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, we need to talk," he said, and we were led to a small consultation room. "Your daughter's condition has stabilized," the doctor began. For a moment, I felt relieved, but the doctor's expression remained grave. However, our detailed examination shows the possibility of serious brain damage. The moment I heard those words, I felt my world crumbling. I could feel Mark squeezing my hand tightly, but all other sensations seemed to have gone numb. The doctor continued, "We've also found signs of long-term abuse. Do you have any idea about this?" We were at a loss for words. We hesitated whether to talk about Judith but decided to reveal everything. The doctor listened with a serious expression and said, "We'll need to contact Child Protective Services." Just then, we heard a commotion in the hallway. When we opened the door, we saw Judith surrounded by nurses. "I have the right to see my granddaughter," she was shouting. Glaring at the doctor, Judith cried out, "I've done nothing wrong." When Mark tried to intervene, Judith lashed out, "This happened because you spoil her too much." Security was called, and Judith was removed from the hospital. However, the chaos left deep scars on our hearts. Emily's future, our family bonds, and our marriage, everything was suddenly called into question. Several weeks have passed since Emily was discharged from the hospital. Life at home has been more challenging than we imagined. Emily's condition was completely different from before, requiring daily care and rehabilitation. Mark and I were exhausted every day, juggling work and therapy. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, we sat facing each other in the living room. Fatigue was evident in Mark's eyes. "Sarah, we can't go on like this. We need to make a decision," he began. I agreed. "But what should we do?" I asked, and Mark let out a deep sigh. "In my opinion, we have two options. One is to sue my mother. The other is..." He hesitated. "The other is..." I prompted, and Mark continued painfully, "to try to reconcile as a family." Those words filled me with intense anger. Reconcile? After what she did to our child, that's absolutely impossible. Mark quietly replied, "I know, Sarah. But Mom had her own issues. Considering her upbringing and past traumas." "That's no excuse," I interrupted. "Emily's future has been ruined." Silence fell. After a while, Mark spoke up. "Sarah, our relationship is in danger too. I feel like I can't handle this stress anymore." Those words brought me back to reality. Indeed, over the past few weeks, we had been blaming each other and arguing more often. "So, what should we do?" I asked in a small voice. Mark took my hand. "First, let's get counseling for ourselves. Then, let's make the best decision for Emily. Whether we take legal action or try to reconcile, let's decide together." That night, we talked for a long time. About Emily's future, our family bonds, and our own relationship. By the time the sun rose, we had finally reached a conclusion. We agreed on the point that we must prioritize Emily's future. For that, we must first become strong ourselves. A month after we started counseling, we decided to meet with a lawyer. We felt legal action was necessary to protect Emily's future and prevent similar tragedies. In the lawyer's office, we explained the whole story. The female lawyer listened intently, occasionally taking notes. When we finished explaining, she quietly began to speak. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, this is clearly a serious case of child abuse. Legally, criminal charges are possible. At those words, Mark's face contorted. I held his hand. No matter how painful the decision, we understood it was necessary for Emily. The lawyer continued, however, since this is also a family matter, I recommend trying mediation first. If that doesn't resolve the issue, we'll move to court proceedings. We looked at each other and nodded. Let's start with mediation, Mark said. The following week, a family meeting including Judith was scheduled. In a tense atmosphere, Judith appeared with her lawyer. The meeting was extremely difficult. At first, Judith tried to justify her actions, but as she faced the evidence, her attitude gradually changed. I might have been wrong, Judith muttered, and the room fell silent. After that, it was discussed that Judith would receive professional psychological counseling. Contact with Emily would only be allowed under supervision for the time being. Judith would bear part of Emily's medical expenses and future care costs, and the whole family would participate in regular therapy sessions. We reached an agreement on these points. A legal settlement was reached and approved by the court. However, this was just the beginning. Emily was receiving rehabilitation at the pediatric neurology department 3 times a week. The schedule was hectic, with speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. Emily showed gradual progress and slowly began to speak words. Mark and I were busy balancing work and rehabilitation. Fortunately, both our workplaces were understanding and allowed us to work flexible hours. Still, the accumulation of fatigue was unavoidable. Family therapy sessions also continued regularly. At first, the atmosphere was awkward, but as we repeated the sessions, we began to understand each other's feelings better. The change in Judith afterward was also significant. She earnestly engaged in counseling and faced her past. Now I understand how terrible my actions were, she said tearfully. Mark had a complex expression on his face as he watched her. I myself was struggling with feelings of self-blame. The thought, if only I had noticed earlier, would occasionally overwhelm me. The counselor repeatedly told me, "You are a victim, not a perpetrator," but it took time for me to fully accept those words. My relationship with Mark also deepened through this experience. By acknowledging each other's weaknesses and supporting each other, our bond became stronger than before. We also started participating in a local support group. Interaction with families who had similar experiences was a great encouragement. The thought, "We're not alone," gave us strength. By the time Emily celebrated her 2nd birthday, she was showing recovery beyond the doctor's expectations. There were still many challenges ahead, but it was certain that a ray of hope had appeared. This journey may never end. However, as we move forward step by step, we have rediscovered our strength as a family. Emily's 5th birthday. Colorful balloons dance in the garden, and laughter fills the air. Emily is chatting happily with her friends. Thanks to speech therapy, her words have become fluent. She still has some difficulties, but she moves around controlling her wheelchair by herself. Her eyes are full of intelligence, keenly observing her surroundings. Mark and I reflected on the past few years. It had been a series of challenges, but also filled with many surprises and joys. Judith is also participating in today's celebration. Seeing her, we realize that people can change. We feel relieved to see her interacting carefully but lovingly with her granddaughter. Life is unpredictable, but that's what makes it beautiful. Judith's words resonate in our hearts. Mark's siblings have also joined the celebration as family members. The former conflicts have now turned into strong bonds. Our marital relationship has also deepened through this experience. Overcoming difficulties has strengthened our trust and love for each other. Emily's growth has taught us many things. Despite her disability, she is blossoming with her own unique talents. She has a gift for writing poetry and is skilled at operating computers. We have started volunteering at local support groups, using our experience to help others. By supporting families in similar situations, we found healing for ourselves as well. I'm glad to be part of this family. Emily whispered these words before blowing out her birthday candles. We couldn't help but tear up at her words. Indeed, our life has taken an unexpected turn. But what we've gained through this journey is immeasurable. The strength of family bonds, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of hope. These give us the strength to overcome any difficulty. The future is still uncertain. But now we have a conviction. No matter what challenges await us, this family can overcome them. Believing this, we continue to move forward. Looking at Emily's smile, I quietly made a vow. Let's cherish each